The white forests of Cathar burned with an almost ceremonial beauty. Flame climbed the pale trunks in rings and sheets, blooming upward through leaves silver as fish scales, and the smoke rolled low over the ground in long, shuddering folds that made the world seem to breathe through a wounded lung. Ash drifted down in such abundance that for an instant, if a soul had been mad enough to forget the smell, it might have looked like snow. It touched Ylira's whiskers and melted into the blood on her mouth. It silvered the dead. She had been hunting when the first ships came over the eastern water, low enough that the sea itself had bucked and broken beneath them. By the time she reached the rise above her pride hall, the roofs were burning and the sky was full of metal. She remembered that first sight with a clarity so absolute it was like a blade held to the eye. Black-hulled transports descending through sun and smoke, armored figures pouring from them with the precision of a machine and the appetite of a storm. The white sands below turning dark wherever they passed. Not raiders, not pirates, not the drunken little militias that plagued lonely trade routes and vanished at the first real blood. These were warriors who had arrived expecting to stay, expecting to take, expecting the galaxy to learn their names. The Mandalorians came in ranks marked by color rather than clan, their armor painted in hard fields of red and ochre and soot black, their visors blind and pitiless. They moved through Cathar's homes as if through brush in a training ground. Doors were kicked in. Walls were pulled down by gauntleted hands. Fires were set not randomly, but with a soldier's intelligence, laid to box survivors toward the dunes. The old and the wounded were not spared because sparing them would have taught the wrong lesson. Ylira had found her brother first, or what remained of him. He lay half beneath a fallen lintel with one hand still curled around the knife he had been too slow to use. Beyond him, in the lee of the smoking hall, 2 cubs clung to their dead mother's robes and made the thin, exhausted sounds of creatures who had already spent all the force terror gave them. Ylira had crawled to them on her elbows, not because she was wounded, though the left side of her body felt hot and wet where shrapnel had gone through muscle, but because every instinct she possessed told her height meant death. From behind a split stone trough, she had seen the Mandalorians driving survivors toward the shoreline in groups of 6 and 10, some with electrostaves, some with blasters, some with nothing but their hands and armored boots, because they had discovered those were enough. There was a rhythm to the killing. That was the worst of it. It was not frenzy. It was not hatred running loose. It was measured, organized, meant to be watched. She did watch. She would remember to the end of her days that she watched. A tall warrior in dark bronze armor strode among the ranks, the crest on his helmet smeared black with soot. He did not shout. The others bent toward his will without requiring sound, and when at last he spoke, his voice carried because all other noise seemed to recoil from it. "Keep the shoreline clear," he said. "No stragglers in the rocks. If they run inland, burn them out." "Cassus Fet," someone near him answered with that title, as if invoking it confirmed reality. Cassus Fet, the name that had traveled ahead of the army like a disease. Ylira saw him halt beside a Cathar woman who stood with both arms spread wide before 3 children. The woman's fur was singed away on one side of her face. Her ears were torn. She had no weapon left. The smallest child had buried his muzzle in the back of her knee, as if some ancestral part of him believed that if he could not see war, then war might not see him. A Mandalorian stepped forward at Fet's gesture. This one was smaller than the rest, narrow through the shoulders, with a red-painted mask and burnished vambraces scratched nearly white at the edges. She raised her blaster. The Cathar woman did not move. Ylira could not tell if the woman was brave or beyond fear. Perhaps the difference had narrowed until it no longer mattered. The Mandalorian with the red mask did not fire. It took only that heartbeat, only that one held second in which she kept her weapon low, and the children still lived for the entire world to tilt. Fet turned his helmet toward her. "Do it." She still did not move. Through the smoke and distance, Ylira could not see the woman's face, but she saw the refusal in the line of her arm, in the way her shoulders locked, in the tiny withdrawal of her head as though she had heard something inside herself louder than command. Cass's fet shot her through the throat. It was so quick, Ylira almost thought she had imagined it. One moment the woman stood, red mask shining through the haze, and the next she was on her knees with both hands clawing at a wound that had already opened too wide to answer prayer. Fet did not look at her again. He stepped past her body and executed the Cathar mother himself. The children died after. One of the Neo-Crusaders turned his visor away before firing, and Ylira would never know if that too was shame or merely distaste. Not far behind Fet stood another Mandalorian, broader, younger, the blue-gray of his armor muddied by soot and shore water. Canderous Ordo. Ylira learned his name much later, but she remembered him then because he alone among the gathered warriors had not shifted in approval when Fet killed his own. He had gone still in a different way. Not soft. Not repentant. Only still, as if the moment had entered him and found somewhere to lodge. The executions continued. A line of Cathar were marched into the surf and shot where the water could take them. Fires were set to the groves behind the village. Somewhere inland, another pride hall collapsed with a long moaning groan that sounded indecently human. The Neo-Crusaders moved with remorseless efficiency between screams and flame, securing landing zones, marking caches, planting charges. This was no raid of anger. This was accounting. Ylira would have died there if the wind had not changed. Smoke blew seaward all at once, thick enough to swallow the shoreline. The Mandalorians cursed and closed ranks. Through the confusion, one of the cubs near Ylira wriggled free from the bodies shielding him, and made for a rock break at the edge of the cove. A soldier saw him and turned. Ylira did not think. She lunged. The impact drove them both into the blackened grass. She slashed upward, felt her claws scrape along armor, felt a knife hilt smash against the side of her skull. Pain burst white behind her eyes. She heard the cub screaming somewhere beneath her. When her vision returned, the Mandalorian had gone down hard with her, and another had moved past without even glancing, too intent on the new order coming from the dunes. The child had vanished into the rocks. Ylira crawled because standing had become impossible. She dragged herself between roots and rubble, under a collapsed skiff, over hot ground that blistered her palms through singed fur. Bodies lay everywhere, Cathar and Mandalorian alike, though the latter were far fewer. Near the shore she found the woman with the red mask where she had fallen. The body had already cooled in the sea wind. One gauntleted hand remained half open, fingers curled as if still shaping refusal. Ylira should have left her there. The armor marked her as enemy. The dead deserved no more weight than the living could carry. Yet something about the woman's last stillness would not let her go. Ylira knelt, swaying, and touched the red mask. It was warmer than it should have been. A deep claw mark crossed one cheek. Salt had dried in a white crescent along the rim. When Ylira lifted it free, she saw that the woman's face beneath was young, almost painfully young, with one eye half open to the sky and surprise frozen inside it. "Why?" Ylira whispered, though she had no right to ask a dead enemy for sense. The wind brought no answer, only smoke and the distant mechanical shriek of engines. So she took the mask. She did not know then what instinct moved her. Not mercy, not reverence. Perhaps only the animal certainty that what had happened here must not be made simple. The Mandalorians had come as one shape: iron, fire, command. Yet one among them had refused. One had chosen death rather than obedience. Ylira hated her for being part of the slaughter and honored her for the moment she had not been. Both things could live together. That, too, would matter later. By nightfall, Cathar's coast looked like the edge of a dead star. Ylira reached a tidal cave where the sea slapped in and out among the rocks with the calm persistence of a thing older than grief. She lay there shivering, the mask clutched against her chest, and listened to her world burn. Above, ships rose and descended. Once, much later, she heard voices in Basic carried by the stone. The clipped reports of soldiers securing perimeter zones, the cold efficiency of departure. When at last the engines began to thin, and the sky opened back into a darkness starred by indifferent light, she wept without sound, because sound felt like a luxury reserved for people who expected to be heard. Morning found her half delirious. A Republic corvette came in low over the water with med-drones already spilling from its belly. Its hull bore the roundel of a government Ylira had been taught all her life to regard as distant, slow, and vaguely benevolent, like weather controlled by senators rather than gods. Its arrival should have brought relief. Instead, she laughed once, a cracked and ruinous sound, because there was something obscene in help arriving only after lesson and corpse and ash. Hands found her. Human hands, gloved and careful. Someone said, "She's alive." Ylira opened her eyes to a bright red cross on a white medpack, to the round face of a trembling young orderly, to the white ruin of her shore behind him. The mask was still in her grip. The orderly tried gently to take it, and she bared her teeth with such violence that he recoiled. "Leave it," another voice said. They did. They wrapped her in a heat foil blanket and carried her through the smoke while the sea kept swallowing the dead. Above them, on the darkening edges of known space, the Mandalorians were already moving toward their next lesson. Coruscant had no business being beautiful on the day the Cathar reports reached full public session, but beauty was one of the capital's oldest habits, and perhaps its most unforgivable. Dawn struck the upper towers in bands of gold so pure they seemed minted. Skyways braided between spires like molten wire. The Senate Rotunda rose from the city's metallic immensity with all the deliberate grandeur of a civilization convinced its architecture could stand in for virtue. Even grief, when admitted here, had to present credentials and wait to be announced. Revan stood in the high gallery reserved for Jedi observers and watched the city perform calm around disaster. Beside him, Alex Quinquargesimus radiated impatience so intensely it seemed another kind of heat. He had taken his gloves off and was flexing one scarred hand open and closed against the gallery rail, as if he could already feel an enemy's throat in it. He had never worn serenity naturally. Other Jedi learned stillness the way children learn posture. Alec learned force, momentum, collision. He was broad through the chest, too alive in his own body to disappear into robes, with a face that would have been handsome if anger had not found in it such a permanent home. Below them, the Senate argued in tones meant to preserve dignity even when dignity had become parody. Refugee manifests from Cathar scrolled in cold blue over the central well. Casualty estimates updated every few breaths. Whole coastal prides marked as extinguished. Agricultural regions lost. Trade disruptions spreading through adjacent systems. The Supreme Chancellor, hollow-eyed beneath the chamber lights, called for order 3 times before the chamber granted him the shallow courtesy of temporary silence. A senator from the Corps rose to question whether the reports had been sufficiently verified. Another demanded immediate naval response and was countered by a bloc more concerned with the cost of mobilization than the cost of failing to do it. A lean woman from the mid-rim held up an image of burned shoreline and asked, in a voice so controlled it made the chamber's evasion seem even uglier, how many worlds had to be taught the same lesson before the Republic understood it was in a war? Revan listened, and what disturbed him most was not cowardice. He knew cowardice. Cowardice had a pulse to it, a human shiver. This was something colder. Procedure. Diffusion of blame. The serene machinery by which responsibility could be divided into so many pieces, no one person needed to feel its weight. At the Chancellor's request, a military transmission opened over the chamber. Admiral Saul Kareth appeared in blue hololight above the central floor, the lines of his face sharpened by static. He had the lean, weathered look of a man who had spent too much of his life near viewport glass and too little in rooms with air scented by flowers. Behind him, officers crossed a bridge humming with suppressed urgency. My outer patrols cannot cover Serroco, terrace approaches, and the Cathar evacuation lanes simultaneously, Kareth said. He did not sound panicked. If anything, his composure made the warning worse. We are dispersing forces beyond strategic sense because the Senate continues to treat each attack as isolated. The Mandalorians are probing, coordinating, and escalating. The word reserves passed through the chamber like sacrilege. More voices rose at once. trade security, border optics, the possibility of provoking wider conflict. Revan felt Alex laugh before he heard it. One bitter breath through the nose. "We are meant to listen to this," Alec murmured. "We are meant to remember it," Revan said. He kept his gaze on the chamber floor, on the floating, hollow images, on the faces of senators who flinched at the scale of the dead, and then recovered quickly enough to protect their own futures. He had studied politics because a Jedi who ignored power could become its instrument without knowing. He had sat through enough hearings to understand that moral failure in the Republic rarely announced itself as evil. More often, it arrived looking prudent. Beyond the gallery arch stood several Jedi Masters in reserved silence. Vandar Tokari's small green figure was nearly lost within the folds of his robes, but his presence held the hall in a quiet all its own. Vrook Lamar stood harder, upright as a blade. Near them, Master Cavar kept his arms folded and his expression unreadable. He watched the chamber not as a philosopher did, but as a soldier measuring the distance between a threat and the nearest honest response. When the session broke into competing committees instead of action, Alec turned from the rail so quickly his robes snapped around his boots. "They're waiting for permission from history," he said. "By the time it arrives, there will be no one left on those worlds to thank them for caution." "History does not give permission," Revan replied. Alec searched his face. "That sounded like you already decided something." Revan did not answer at once. He looked down into the well where aides were clustering around senators, where fresh figures for destroyed housing and food deficits had already replaced the images of the dead. Numbers were easier to survive than faces. Bureaucracies understood this. It was one of their deepest sins. He said, "I have decided that distance is teaching everyone here to lie to themselves." They left the gallery by a side passage used when the Order preferred not to be seen as participating in politics, while it benefited from proximity to power. The corridor opened into a high arcade of polished stone and hanging gardens. Beneath the perfume of imported flowers lurked antiseptic and smoke carried in on emergency transports. Coruscant's upper levels had become a choreography of denial and intrusion. Every landing platform near the Senate quarter was crowded with refugee craft that had been granted temporary clearance, but no dignity. Families slept under thermal sheets within sight of towers plated in diplomatic gold. As they crossed toward the Temple Causeway, Alex slowed. Ahead of them, through a security partition, med teams were processing survivors from Cathar. Some sat stunned and upright on repulsor stretchers, too exhausted even to cling to grief. Some keened softly. Some stared at the city around them with the disorientation of creatures dragged from one climate to another so violently their bodies had not yet accepted the change. One of them was a Cathar woman with one side of her face bandaged and both hands closed around an object wrapped in cloth. Even from a distance, Revan sensed the force with which she held herself together. Around her, the hall blurred with motion. Droids, nurses, officials, intake clerks. But she remained motionless, as if any movement not chosen would shatter the last hard shape of her will. Alec followed Revan's gaze. "You're thinking of going down there." "I'm thinking of listening." "To what? Grief?" "Yes." Alec leaned against the partition and looked past it toward the city's endless traffic, his jaw tight. "The Council will say the same thing they always say, that we do not answer one horror by becoming instruments of another. That war narrows the spirit. That anger is not justice." "Nay. Nay. All of that is true. Then why do you look like you want to tear these walls apart?" Revan turned toward him. The question had no mockery in it, only fear. And because it was Alec, fear disguised as challenge. "Because," Revan said quietly, "there are people dying while the Republic debates the moral texture of response. Because the Mandalorians are not testing the frontier. They are testing the belief that institutions matter more than lives. And because if the Jedi say only wise things while worlds burn, wisdom will become another word for absence." "Nay." Alec's hand stilled on the rail. "Do you think the Masters don't know that?" "I think they know it," Revan said. "I am no longer certain they know what to do with the knowledge." The temple loomed above them on its rise of stone and light, serene as doctrine. For a moment Revan hated it. Not the building itself, not the order, but the illusion its stillness offered. The idea that enough calm in one place could compensate for carnage elsewhere. He knew better. The Force did not distribute suffering like a ledger balanced at the end of a season. One world broken remained broken even if 1,000 others meditated at dawn. On the causeway, initiates passed in ordered lines, their faces young enough still to believe moral clarity would announce itself in time to be useful. Revan wondered what the galaxy was preparing to teach them. Behind him, in the processing hall below, the Cathar woman refused to let the attendants take the bundle from her hands. The refugee sanctuary beneath the temple had once been an archive annex. The old alcove still held recesses for holocrons and relic cases, though now the shelves were stacked with medpacks, ration bricks, folded blankets, and filtered water canisters. The place smelled of bacta, damp cloth, antiseptic, and the sour edge of too many frightened bodies held in too little space. White dividers hung from ceiling tracks to create the illusion of privacy, but sound passed through them easily. Coughing, whispered prayers, children waking into terror, med droids offering comfort in soft mechanical tones no living throat could sustain for long without breaking. Revan came without escort and without ceremony. That too was a choice. Jedi were often brought into suffering as symbols before they were welcomed as people. He had learned young that symbols could numb almost as effectively as sedatives. Better to arrive plainly and sit before speaking. The Cathar woman from the intake hall had been given a cot near one of the vent shafts where the air moved coolest. Her name, he learned from the datapad clipped to the frame, was Illyra of the Southern Tide Pride. Extensive burns, blood loss, concussion. No confirmed surviving immediate family. The bureaucratic phrasing made absence look neat. He set the pad down without reading the rest. Illyra watched him approach with the unsparing stillness of a hunting cat too injured to flee and too proud to beg. Up close, the damage on her face was worse than it had appeared through glass. One ear was torn nearly through. The fur along her neck and collar had burned away in patches, leaving raw pink skin beneath the salve. Yet the object in her lap remained untouched by medcare. It lay wrapped in a singed strip of linen, and both her hands rested on it like guards on a coffin. "You are Revan," she said. He inclined his head. "I am. Not Master Revan. No. Good." Her voice scraped at the edges, smoke and injury roughening it to a harsh whisper. "I am tired of titles." A child in the next cot whimpered in sleep. Beyond the curtain, someone was being sick into a bowl. Revan pulled a stool close and sat. He did not reach for the bundle. He did not ask her to tell him anything. He let silence open and settle between them until it became something shared rather than imposed. At last, Illyra said, "Do Jedi listen because it is useful, or because you care? The answer changes with the Jedi. And yours?" Revan considered lying. Not from malice, but because the vulnerable often wanted certainty from those who wore robes and carried lightsabers. He had learned to distrust certainty offered too quickly. "Because caring is useful," he said. "And because usefulness without caring becomes another kind of violence." For the first time, some small measure of approval moved through her expression. She looked down at the bundle and unwrapped the cloth. The mask lay in her lap like a cooled ember. Red, though the red was darkened by soot and dried blood. Mandalorian make, narrow-cheeked, T-visored, with a long claw scratch cutting across the left side. Whoever had worn it had taken care of it once. The damage looked recent. Revan felt the echo before his fingers touched it. Fear. Ugh. Fire. Obedience. Refusal. A last violent burst of pain. Objects did not hold memory as living beings did. Yet sometimes the Force gathered itself strangely around choice, especially choice made under mortal pressure. The mask was heavy with that residue. "A Mandalorian wore this on Cathar," Illyra said. "A woman. She was ordered to kill children. She did not. Cassius Fett killed her for it." Alec had entered without Revan hearing him. He stood a few paces back with his arms folded, and the name tightened every line of him. Ylira went on. I took it from her body while my home burned. At first I kept it because hatred needed shape. Then I kept it because hatred was too easy. She came with them. She wore their armor. She helped bring death to my world. Yet in the last moment given to her, she chose not to become what they wanted. Her clawed thumb moved once across the cracked red cheek of the mask. I do not know what use a Jedi has for such things. I know only that I survived and she did not, and survival without memory becomes permission. So take it. Revan did not move. Why me? He asked. Ylira's wounded gaze lifted to his face. Because I watched the Senate feed our dead into numbers. Because the officials who processed us looked already beyond us to the next ship. Because you came here without witnesses. Because when I saw you in the hall, you looked at us as though our ruin had entered you and stayed there. And because if there is to be war, I would rather one man in it remember that even an enemy had a moment to choose. Alec made a small, sharp sound that might have been disbelief or admiration. Revan reached out at last. The metal was colder than he expected. The moment his hands closed around it, the sanctuary around him seemed to recede. Not vanish. He was too disciplined for that. But dim, as if the Force had leaned nearer. He felt again the split-second held breath of refusal, the blast that followed, the drowning tide of Cathar grief around it. It was not the clear echo of a relic shaped by centuries. It was raw, immediate, human, though not human at all. The kind of memory that did not ask to be sanctified, only carried. I cannot promise you vengeance, he said. Ylira's ears tipped back with something like contempt. Good. Good. Vengeance is a starving animal. I am not feeding you one. He held the mask in his lap and understood that some objects did not become symbols by declaration. They became symbols because history required a body in which to lodge. This mask carried not only defiance but contradiction. The enemy could refuse its own worst order. A survivor could preserve an enemy's last honorable act. Justice, then, if it was to mean anything, would have to be large enough to contain more than hatred. Alec stepped closer. If Revan takes this, he said, he will not set it aside easily. That is why I'm giving it to him, Ylira replied. The simplicity of that answer struck deeper than accusation would have. Revan bowed his head. Not to the mask. To her. Then, I will carry it. Something in Ylira loosened, though whether it was relief or exhaustion he could not tell. She settled back against the cot frame and closed her eyes. For a while no one spoke. The sanctuary's sounds returned around them, the hiss of a sterilizer wand, the murmur of a lullaby in a language older than the Republic, boots moving fast in the corridor beyond. At length Alec said, You know what the Council will see. Revan still looked at the mask. Yes. They'll say it draws you toward war. It does. Alec barked a humorless laugh. At least you're honest. Revan turned the mask in his hands. Inside the visor, soot had settled into the mesh like black sand. Along the lower rim were tiny scored marks, perhaps from long use, perhaps from teeth clenched inside it. He imagined the woman who had worn it. Imagined the discipline that had brought her across stars under Mandalorian command, and the single impossible moment in which some deeper law had overridden obedience. Choice was never more visible than when it cost. War was already here, he said. This only prevents me from pretending otherwise. When they left Ylira's cot, Alec walked beside him in uncharacteristic silence. They crossed an upper gallery overlooking the sanctuary floor, and below them Revan could see the rows of displaced beings huddled under Republic blankets, stamped with supply codes and Senate seals. Aid had its own aesthetics. Orderly, numbered, impersonal. It was useful and insufficient at once. You're thinking about wearing it, Alec said finally. Not yet. But you are thinking it. Revan stopped at a window slit cut into the old stone. Beyond it, the underlayers of Coruscant dropped away in canyons of metal and neon. Traffic lanes glimmered in stacked rivers. Far above, hidden by distance and wealth, the Senate towers caught the late light. "A symbol is a dangerous thing," he said. "It can free people from fear or free them from doubt. And which do you want?" "I want the Republic to stop mistaking procedure for morality." Alec leaned against the wall and studied him. "That is not the answer I asked for." "No," Revan agreed. That night he took the mask to his quarters and cleaned it himself. He used water first, then solvent, then a cloth, softened by heat to lift soot from the carved seams. Under the grime the red returned, not bright, but deep, almost like dried blood under lacquer. The claw mark across one cheek remained. He left it. Some scars were a history more honest than restoration. When the mask was clean, he set it on the table and sat before it for a long time in the dark. Krya had once told him, in the years when he was still young enough to mistake enigmatic speech for wisdom, that history left impressions in the living more deeply than in stone. Stones remembered impact. Living beings remembered meaning. At the time he had found the distinction irritating. Now, watching the city lights pulse against the window, he began to understand. Cathar was not becoming important because it had burned. Worlds had burned before. Cathar would matter because enough people would choose to carry the meaning of its ruin forward. He did not sleep. By morning, the first urgent reports from Serroco had arrived. The flagship of Mandalore, the ultimate, carried no ornament that was not also threat. Its corridors were wide enough for armored warriors to pass each other at a run, and narrow enough that anyone meeting them uninvited would feel trapped. Trophies hung only in places where they might sharpen memory rather than soften it. Broken standards fused into bulkheads, damaged helmets mounted beside star charts, the polished skull of some great beast from a conquered moon, set above a hatch where every officer entering the war chamber would have to look at it, and remember that victory had a face. Mandalore stood at the center table in armor dark as forge-quenched iron, one gauntlet resting on the edge of a holographic projection of the outer rim. The blue light climbed the ridges of his cuirass and died in the black slit of his visor. He looked less like a man presiding over maps than a statue of war that had chosen, for one dangerous hour, to move. Around him waited commanders stripped by the Neo-Crusader order of much of the old clan display that had once defined Mandalorian politics. The reform had not erased the clans. Nothing so old died cleanly. But on campaign, rank, color, and battle function mattered more than bloodline. That was Cassius Fett's genius. He understood that if the Mandalorians wished to strike not as raiders, but as a conquering force, identity itself had to be sharpened into a weapon. Cassius stood opposite Mandalore, hands braced on the table as route lines burned between his fingers. "Serroco next," he said. "They are expecting raids. They are not prepared for coordinated corridor denial. Relief convoys are already massing there. The Republic always rushes to the place where suffering can be seen." "Nay, then let them see more of it," one commander said. A few helmets turned in approval. Canderous Ordo said nothing. He had fought since boyhood. He knew battle's honest intoxication, knew the fierce simplicity of standing at another warrior's measure and finding joy in survival. Cathar had not disturbed him because civilians died. Civilians always died when weak governments sheltered behind distance and let war arrive unchallenged. It disturbed him because of the woman in the red mask, because of the clean, casual way Cassius had killed her, and because some traitorous corner of him had recognized strength in the refusal. Mandalorians honored strength. That was the first law children learned. Yet what happened when strength and obedience severed from each other? He had no language for that unease. So he buried it where soldiers buried many things. Cassius shifted the projection. Serroco swelled above the table, a dun-colored world veined with old mining routes and bright with evacuation traffic. "We shatter the convoy network here," he said. "Not simply the warships, the civilian lanes. Let them choose between protecting fleets and protecting the helpless. Let their compassion become a weakness they can count." Mandalore's helmet tilted a fraction. Compassion is weakness only when it lacks discipline. Cassius accepted the correction with a shallow nod. Then we teach them it lacks discipline. The chamber's air hummed with contained approval. Mandalore looked down at the world turning in blue light. There were those among his captains who mistook him for a zealot of mere conquest, a beast crowned by armor, driven by appetite and old tales. Let them think so if it steadied their loyalty. A commander did not owe transparency to every sword that served him. But conquest for him was never only hunger. Hunger alone made for bandits. He sought transformation. Years before, in a place so far beyond map certainty that even memory seemed to dim around it, he had stood before a power older and colder than republics, older perhaps than the forms most civilizations used for evil. He had not knelt. Mandalorians did not kneel easily, but he had listened. He had heard of a galaxy grown soft in the aftermath of older wars, of institutions decaying beneath ceremony, of a people who believed peace was a right rather than a condition that had to be earned and defended. He had been told the Republic would break under real pressure. He had been challenged to prove it. Whether the voice that challenged him had intended to shape tool or threat mattered less than the challenge itself. A weak galaxy deserved culling or hardening, perhaps both. He said, "The Republic has forgotten that survival is a discipline. We will remind it." No one in the chamber asked where that conviction had first been forged. Mandalorians respected origins only so long as they produced results. Cassius called up intercept fragments. Republic logistics delays. Senate disputes over reserve deployment. Jedi advisories urging restraint. One clipped note from an outer command described 2 Jedi on Coruscant pressing for intervention. One name appeared 3 times in attached annotations. Revan die. Canderous saw it as clearly as any of them, though the name meant little yet beyond rumor. A knight with followers among the younger order. A mind too quick for deference. A presence at refugee processing on Coruscant. Cassius dismissed the line with a flick of his wrist. "The Jedi remain divided," he said. "Their caution serves us." "For now," Mandalore said. The word landed with a weight that made several commanders straighten. Cassius smiled thinly beneath his helmet, or perhaps Canderous only imagined it. "Then let them come. Better to break them early." "Nay, d'ici, mentire." Mandalore's gauntlet closed around the projection until the blue world fractured into light. "No, better to force them to answer on ground we choose in a war whose terms we define. The enemy that comes too soon does us less good than the enemy ripened by necessity." There it was again. Not merely conquest, but cultivation. Cassius understood it. Canderous did not want to. A younger officer asked, "And Cathar?" The chamber dimmed, not in light, but in attention. Cassius answered before Mandalore could. Cathar served its purpose. Mandalore said nothing for a moment. Then, "A lesson heard only once is a wasted cruelty." Canderous felt that sentence move through the room like a knife withdrawn from meat. It was not remorse. It was discipline of another kind. Even atrocity, in Mandalore's conception, had to justify itself by effect. To him, waste was the only unforgivable softness. He issued commands with austere clarity. Assault wings to the Serroco approaches. Basilisk riders along the sun-shadowed vector where Republic convoy sensors would be weakest. Interdiction mines seated in routes used by medical ships. Boarding detachments instructed to prioritize communications, nodes, and evac transponders. Spare one cluster. Let survivors flee through it. Terror needed witnesses more than corpses. As the commanders broke away to their stations, Mandalore signaled Canderous to remain. The war chamber emptied until only the 2 of them and the low hum of the star table remained. Canderous stood without speaking. He would have preferred an accusation or a task. Silence in the presence of authority could be more dangerous than anger. "You watched Fett kill one of our own on Cathar," Mandalore said. Canderous kept his gaze level. "Yes. And?" Canderous thought of lying. He let the impulse pass. She disobeyed. That is not an answer. No, Canderous said. It is the fact. Mandalore was still for so long the ship's engine vibrations seemed loud. At last he said, battle reveals weakness, strength, fear, loyalty, the shape of a people's future. You are wondering what Cathar revealed of us. Canderous did not ask how Mandalore knew. Commanders who endured often cultivated the appearance of omniscience until appearance no longer mattered. I am wondering, Canderous said carefully, whether all victories harden us the right way. Mandalore's laugh was low, almost approving. Good. Keep wondering. A warrior who never questions his own edge wakes one day to find it has rusted in his hand. There was more mercy in the words than Canderous expected, and for that reason he trusted them less. Go to Serroco, Mandalore said. Fight well. Watch closely. The Republic is about to tell us what kind of enemy it wishes to be. Nagum. Canderous saluted and left. As he strode through the flagship's armored corridors toward the launch decks, he passed racks of helmets waiting for riders, rows of basilisk war droids chained and dormant like metal predators dreaming of vacuum, crews checking charges and thruster seals with the reverence priests might show sacred objects. Mandalorian life had been compressed into motion so long ago that stillness now felt decadent. Even meals were brief. Even sleep looked like recovery between blows. He should have felt only anticipation. Instead, he thought of a red mask in the ash, and of a name on a Republic intercept that he could not quite dismiss. Serroco turned in the dark ahead, already marked. Serroco from orbit looked like a world that had once expected to matter greatly, and then been worn down by time into utility. Its continents were old, dry masses striped with defunct mining scars, and the pale geometries of abandoned extraction towns. Only along the equatorial belts did fresh light gather. Newer settlements, freight depots, convoy platforms, the clustered engines of ships trying to lift more lives off the surface than physics had ever been designed to carry at once. Revan stood on the bridge of the hammerhead cruiser Valor and watched the traffic pattern collapse toward crisis. Admiral Saul, Kareth commanded from the central ring with the clipped economy of a man who had accepted hours ago that the position was unsustainable and intended to hold it anyway. He did not waste motion. Orders snapped from him in precise bursts. Redirect that escort line. Hold missile reserves. Prioritize medical transports on lanes 3 and 6. He had the look of someone who would gladly have cursed the Senate aloud if cursing could generate another squadron. The outer pickets are late, Alec muttered from Revan's left. They're dead, Kareth said without turning. No one on the bridge objected because no one had the energy for false hope. Revan had come aboard as observer and liaison, an absurd title made necessary by a republic that still wanted Jedi presence without Jedi commitment. The Council had not sanctioned military command. The Senate had not sanctioned escalation. Yet here he stood in the red gloom of battle readiness, with a lightsaber at his hip and the dead of Cathar still moving through him like a second pulse. He felt the trap before the sensors confirmed it. A wrongness opened along the edge of perception, not mystical so much as structural, like hearing a melody and realizing a note everyone expected has been withheld. Too much empty space on the starboard approach. Too much clean geometry in the convoy drift. A derelict ore hauler tumbling at exactly the angle an ambush would prefer. He stepped toward the forward pit. Admiral. Kareth was already speaking to Tactical. Bring up magnification on the hauler. The image expanded. At first it showed only frozen hull plating and the dull glint of cargo brackets. Then the ore hauler's ventral seam burst outward, and basilisk war droids dropped from its belly like released teeth. Everything after that happened at battle speed, which is to say faster than language and slower than death. Sirens went full-throated. Red strips ignited along the deck. The first basilisk riders hit the lead escort's dorsal hull in a spray of sparks and atmosphere. More burst from behind the glare of the local sun where their thermal signature had hidden in plain sight. Missile traces lanced between convoy ships. A medical transport trying to break upward lost engines and began to yaw, scattering debris and frozen bodies from a breached midsection. Interdiction mines on lanes 2 and 4, Tactical shouted. Who seeded them? Another officer demanded, as if the question mattered more than surviving the answer. Mandalorians, Kareth said. Who else? He looked at Revan then just once, and in that glance something tacit passed between them. Whatever titles had been meant to contain this moment were already irrelevant. Can you help me hold the civilian corridors? Kareth asked. Yes, Revan said. That was all permission he required. He moved to the tactical array and drew the battle into comprehension. Not total comprehension, no mind had that luxury under fire, but enough to act. The Mandalorians had not come to destroy Serroco outright from the start. They had come to fracture the convoys into panic and force the Republic to choose where compassion would fail first. Civilians clogged the escape lanes. Warships could not maneuver freely without crushing what they meant to save. Every decent instinct had been weaponized against them. Vent Lane 6, Revan said. No. An officer stared. There are shuttles on 6. There are also basilisks using the thermal wake to mask their approach. Vent it now and transmit reroute on 6A through 6D. Phrase it as reactor contamination, or half the pilots will hesitate. Kareth made a slicing gesture. The order went out. On the main viewport, atmosphere blew from the evacuated corridor in a dazzling plume. 2 basilisks emerging through it spun offline, their riders thrown momentarily wide. Republic guns caught one. The other corrected and slammed into the hull of an escort corvette so hard the corvette folded around the impact like thin sheet metal. A second wave hit the Valor. The deck shuddered. Lights blew out in a cascade down the port wall. Somewhere below, metal screamed with the sound of a breached compartment sealing too slowly. Alec was already moving before the damage report finished scrolling. Borders, he said, and looked at Revan with fierce delight sharpened by necessity. Try not to win the whole war without me. Revan almost told him to stay. Then he saw the Marines rallying toward Alec as naturally as filings toward a magnet, and understood that command was not only intellect, it was force of presence. Alec would hold the internal lines better than any officer on that deck. Take Section C and the dorsal access ladders, Revan said. Do not chase kills. Hold the reactor spine. Alec grinned once, wolfish and bright. You always ruin the fun. Then he was gone with 2 squads of Marines at his back, boots hammering the deck. Revan bent over the tactical display as if he could physically press order into chaos. He rerouted 3 crippled transports into the shadow of the Valor's bulk. He ordered tractor beams cut from a dead freighter so it could be used as moving cover for 2 refugee barges trying to clear Lane 5 data. He told communications to patch his voice directly into the convoy net, not because he imagined his presence would soothe panic, but because panic without clear instruction became mass murder. This is Revan, he said into the bridge comm. No title, no explanation. All civilian traffic on lanes 2, 4, and 6. Cut thrusters for 3 seconds on my mark and drift. Escorts, flare shields forward and hold. Do not break formation to pursue riders. They want you chasing ghosts. Mark. All. Nigh. Against all reasonable odds. Enough people obeyed. Ships drifted. Shields flared. A stream of missiles intended for fleeing liners hit the reinforced forward arcs of 2 hammerheads instead. One cruiser took the impact badly and broke amidships in a thunderclap of white vapor, but its broken hulk shielded 9 transports behind it. Revan registered the sacrifice, filed it, moved on. Battle did not stop because something noble occurred. A scream of static cut across the bridge speakers. One of the surface platforms had lost anti-orbital cover. Feed flashed in. Desert wind. Civilians running through blowing dust. 3 basilisk riders descending like iron birds. Then nothing but noise and orange bloom. Serroco below had begun to burn. The force pressed against Revan from every direction now, too crowded for elegance. Fear here. Pain there. A pilot making the wrong correction out of love for the children in the transport he was trying to shield. a gunner freezing because the target lock ahead included a stolen medship full of Serrocan refugees chained in the cargo bay. The Mandalorians had prepared even that. They were not merely attacking bodies. They were attacking conscience. "Admiral," Tactical called, voice cracking. "If we hold this position, we lose the lower lanes. If we break position, we lose the bridge between lanes and the planet," Kareth snapped back. Revan saw the shape then. Not victory. There was none left in the old sense. But there was a path through catastrophe narrow enough to matter. "Break line by thirds," he said. "Not full retreat. Staggered descent on the southern pole and use planetary curvature to screen the surviving convoy. We give the surface batteries a firing window and force the Mandalorians to split pursuit." Kareth looked at him. "We lose the outer escorts." "Yes." "And the mining stations." "Yes." Kareth turned back to command. "Do it." There was no hesitation in him now. That, more than rank, was why men followed Saul Kareth. Once he chose completely. The Valor rolled hard to port. Stars slewed across the viewport. Revan caught himself on the console rail as the cruiser plunged toward the planet's limb. Behind them, the outer escorts peeled away in a sacrificial arc, trading themselves for seconds and sightlines. One detonated so near a boarding basilisk that rider and wreckage became the same incandescent cloud. On the comm, Alex's voice burst through over weapons fire. "We have 3 boarders in the dorsal spine, and one of them is bigger than my patience. Can you hold?" A pause. Blaster crackle. Someone shouting. Then, breathless and savage, "I can hold anything." Revan allowed himself one heartbeat of relief. At the far edge of the tactical screen, a Mandalorian strike unit broke from the main assault and drove for the crippled medical transport that had begun the fight spinning. He enlarged the feed. Through smoke and rotating debris, he saw mag boots bite into hull. Blue-gray armor. Heavy blasters. One figure moved at the front with a ruthless steadiness that distinguished him even amid battle. Canderous, though Revan did not yet know the name. "Docking clamps on the med transport are still responsive," he said. "I'm taking Shuttle 9. Kareth turned sharply. "I need you here. You need those civilians alive." The Admiral held his gaze half a second longer than protocol allowed. Then he said, "Take a security team." Revan took 6 Marines and no more. The shuttle transit felt like flying through the throat of a furnace. Wreckage ricocheted off the hull. The medical transport ahead spun slow and wrong. One side peeled open to vacuum. Through the breach he could see bodies pinned in straps, some moving, some not. Mandalorians had already entered through a secondary airlock. They were not there for prisoners. They were there because civilian terror carried farther than tactical gain. Revan cut through the jammed hatch with his lightsaber and went into smoke. Inside, gravity flickered between stuttering pulses. The corridor was full of floating supplies, blood droplets, scorched restraint straps. A nurse hit the wall near him with enough force to crack bone and slid past, eyes wide and empty. He caught her body one-handed and guided it aside without pausing. Ahead, blaster fire lit the narrow passage in violent blue bursts. The first Mandalorian rounded the bend and saw a robed figure carrying green light where one should not have been. Surprise killed him. The second ducked, fired low, and almost took one of the Marines in the leg. Revan deflected twice, advanced, felt rather than saw a third attacker clinging magnetized to the ceiling, and pivoted in time to split the rifle from his hands. War compressed people into fragments. Angle, instinct, pressure, choice. There was no room here for moral speeches. Only action and consequence. When he reached the passenger hold, he found 37 civilians strapped into crash harnesses, and 3 Mandalorians moving among them with almost ceremonial deliberation. One of the civilians was a child with an evac tag from Cathar still hanging around her neck. The sight turned the whole room momentarily strange. The leading Mandalorian leveled his blaster at the child and said through external speakers, distorted by helmet steel, "Choose." Revan did not answer because the demand was false. There are moments in war when one must choose between losses, and then there are moments when the enemy merely wishes to make witness complicit in cruelty. He hurled the nearest crash frame instead. Metal and bodies collided. The shot went wide. The room became chaos. Later he would remember only flashes, a Marine dying without sound as a vibroblade went through the seam below his chin. The child from Cathar screaming not in fear but rage. A Mandalorian warrior kicking off the wall in 0G and coming at him like a thrown axe. The smell of scorched plastic and opened blood. One attacker escaped. 2 died. The civilians lived. When Revan came back to the Valor, Serroco was half hidden beneath its own rising dust and fire. The Republic had not been annihilated. The convoys had not been fully destroyed. Yet none of that resembled success. The mining stations were gone. Surface settlements along the southern belts burned openly. Thousands had escaped because thousands more had not. The Mandalorians disengaged in good order, leaving wreckage and lessons behind. Alec met him in the dorsal corridor with blood on one sleeve and triumph in his grin. "You missed the best part." Revan looked at the torn armor around him, the med droids carrying the dead, the shaken Marines trying not to stare at him with newly formed myth in their eyes. "No," he said. "I don't think I did." Kareth joined them minutes later, face gray with fatigue. For a moment, the Admiral said nothing. He looked past Revan toward the viewport where Serroco turned beneath scattered flame. "This will be called a managed withdrawal," Kareth said at last. "On Coruscant they will say we preserved strategic assets and prevented total loss." Revan heard the bitterness beneath the discipline. "And what will you say?" Kareth's mouth hardened. "That the Mandalorians understand us better than we understand ourselves." Below them, on the wounded surface of Serroco, the wind carried fire through abandoned streets. The council chamber on Coruscant was built to make emotion feel temporary. Stone lifted in clean circles toward a domed ceiling that drank noise, and returned every spoken word, softened by architecture, into something resembling reason. Sunlight entered through high slits and fell in angled sheets across the floor. On most days, the chamber's restraint comforted Revan. On this day, it struck him as a room designed by people who hoped light itself could be argued into obedience. The masters waited in their seats as he and Alec entered. Vondar Takare at the center, grave and remote in the way only truly compassionate beings ever became, because they had learned that feeling too much could destroy function. Rook Lamar, rigid with disapproval, sharpened into certainty. Kavar, quiet as a drawn bow. Jar and Dorak, watchful on either side. None of them looked surprised to see weariness in Raven's face or blood, still dried in the seams of Alec's boots. News from Serroco had reached the temple before they returned. "You acted beyond sanction," Vrook said, dispensing with ceremony. "We acted to save lives," Alec replied before Revan could speak. Rook's gaze cut to him. "You acted as soldiers." Alec took one step forward. "Would you prefer witnesses?" "Alec," Revan said. It was enough. Alec stopped, though the effort of doing so showed. Vandar folded his small hands into his sleeves. "Tell us what happened." Revan did. Not every detail. The council had access to reports and recordings. He gave them instead the shape of the encounter, the seeded interdiction mines, the deliberate targeting of medical and evacuation lanes, the use of civilian terror to fracture command decisions, the discipline with which the Mandalorians disengaged once they had maximized strategic and psychological damage. He told them the enemy was not testing border security in isolated incidents. The enemy was constructing a war out of the Republic's own assumptions. When he finished, silence lingered. Dorak asked, "And what do you conclude from this?" "That the Mandalorians mean to force the Republic into a conflict it is morally and politically unprepared to fight," Revan said. "That they are succeeding, and that each delay in response becomes part of their weapon." Vrook leaned forward. "Your conclusion is tactical. I am asking what you conclude as a Jedi." Revan held the older master's stare. "That there are worlds burning while we debate language." A current passed through the chamber then, slight but unmistakable. Not outrage. Recognition. The dangerous kind, because it acknowledged truth while resisting its implications. Cathar spoke for the first time. Serroco changes matters. Every massacre changes matters, Alex said. Only we refuse to notice until the changes become inconvenient. Rook's palm struck the arm of his chair with a sound like a snapped branch. Enough. The word echoed against stone. You mistake indignation for clarity, he said. Yes, Serroco was a horror. Yes, the Republic is failing its citizens. None of that grants the Jedi license to become the blade every frightened politician wishes to swing. We have seen what happens when the Order lets war define its purpose. We lose sight of the Force and begin to worship results. No. Is that what saving civilians looked like to you from this chamber? Alex shot back. Revan spoke before Vrook could. Master Vrook is not wrong about the danger. Alec turned to him as if struck. Several masters did the same. Revan went on. War narrows people. It rewards certainty, speed, obedience, and the habit of sorting lives into numbers because numbers are easier to move. I felt that at Serroco. I know the danger. But danger does not dissolve duty. The Mandalorians are not waiting for our spiritual readiness. They are killing the Republic while counting on our reluctance to enter ugliness. Nah, Bendiche. Jar's voice was soft. You believe reluctance itself has become a sin. I believe, Revan said, that abstention can become vanity when others pay for it in blood. Vandar's ears lowered slightly, a sign of sorrow more than anger. There is darkness behind this war. Revan almost smiled, though without humor. Then all the more reason not to leave the Republic to face it alone. You hear only part of what I say, Vandar replied. Darkness behind the war, yes. Not merely in the Mandalorians, around them, guiding, waiting. If the Order rushes toward battle without understanding what calls us, we may answer the wrong enemy in the wrong way, and give the Hidden One exactly what it desires. The warning struck home because Revan had felt it too, in fragments, at the edge of perception. A pressure behind events. A pattern too deliberate to be explained by ambition alone. Yet to recognize manipulation did not make inaction wisdom. Then we investigate while protecting those under attack, he said. The tasks are not opposed. Spoken like a commander, Vrook said. Perhaps command is what the moment requires. The words settled harder than he intended. Alex's head snapped toward him, not in disagreement but in fierce, startled approval. Cathar looked away. Vandar closed his eyes briefly, and in that small gesture Revan saw grief before loss had even finished approaching. Revan, Vandar said, you are one of the most gifted among us. That is why this matters more. You inspire. You draw others. If you choose war, you will not go alone. You will take many with you, and every death thereafter will thread through your decision, whether or not your hands hold the weapon. Nadi, Kanda, Kandi, Ei, Dom, Tasu. Tuama, Kasranting, Asiu, Armando. The chamber seemed suddenly very bright. Revan thought of Ylira placing the mask in his hands. Of the med ship at Serroco. Of Kareth choosing to lose outer escorts to save a corridor. Of Alec laughing at danger because the alternative was paralysis. Of Cathar children buried in surf. History was already threading deaths through decisions. The only question was whose decisions they would be. I know, he said. No, Vrook said. You do not. You imagine you can step into war and remain yourself because your intentions are noble. All who fall begin by believing they are the exception. Alec took a breath sharp enough to answer, but Cathar lifted one hand and the younger knight held. Revan bowed his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement that Vrook's warning had truth in it. That perhaps made what came next harder for the chamber to refuse. I do not believe I am the exception, he said. I believe the danger is real. I believe war will mark all who enter it. I believe some who go will not return. and some who return will not be who they were. But I also believe a Jedi Order that protects only its own inner balance, while the innocent die ceases in time to be worthy of that balance. No one moved. Outside the chamber, faint through old stone, Coruscant's traffic sang on in endless metallic rivers. The council withdrew into private deliberation and recalled them only long enough to issue formal instruction. No unsanctioned military command, no independent deployments, continued investigation, continued aid, continued restraint. Restraint. Die. The word followed Revan from the chamber like a ghost trying to keep pace with a living man. He walked alone afterward through a side cloister where the temple walls looked west over layered districts and slow descending dusk. His quarters waited above, neat and impersonal in the way training encouraged. He entered, closed the door, and stood without lighting the room. The red mask lay where he had left it. For a long time he only looked at it. Then he picked it up and put it on. The seal settled cool against his skin. The world narrowed through the T-shaped visor, not into blindness, but into decision. Peripheral distraction fell away. Light changed. His own breath sounded different, no longer merely his, but mediated by metal and echo. He understood in an instant why warriors learned to live inside helmets. They simplified identity. They turned expression into instrument. He removed it almost at once, unsettled by how natural it had felt. Yet when he set it down again, he knew something had already shifted. The council had not lost him. Not yet. But their words no longer occupied the highest seat in his mind. Beyond the temple walls, the war was gathering shape. And now, for the first time, he could imagine the shape under which he might answer it. At his door, a chime sounded. Alec entered without waiting for permission. He took one look at Revan, at the mask on the table, and let out a slow breath through his teeth. "So," Alec said, "that far already." Revan did not deny it. Alec's anger had burned down into something more dangerous, relief. "Tell me when," he said. He did not choose rebellion in a grand room under witness. He chose it in an old cargo undercroft beneath the temple where obsolete lift assemblies and broken archive housings had been pushed against the walls and forgotten. The room smelled of dust and machine oil. The light panels flickered. 12 people stood waiting when Revan entered. By the time he finished speaking, there were 21. Some were young Jedi Knights. Some were Padawans too near knighthood to accept passivity as spiritual maturity. One wore the plain insignia of a Republic signals officer and kept looking over her shoulder as if she half expected security to materialize out of the wall. Mitra Surik stood near the back, quiet and straight-backed, hands folded within her sleeves. She watched everything and betrayed nothing except attention, which in the young could be more formidable than certainty. Alec leaned against a crate like war in human shape. Revan did not stand above them. He stayed on the floor among them because anything else would have made the room a court and him a claimant. He had no patience for courts. "The council believes time favors wisdom," he said. "The Senate believes delay is cheaper than decision. The Mandalorians believe both things can be turned against us. So far, they are right." No one interrupted. "I am not here to offer revenge. Revenge is simple, and simplicity is not the same as justice. I am here because the Republic is losing worlds one moral hesitation at a time. If we wait for the galaxy to become less dangerous before we act, we will inherit only its ruins." "Duh," a young knight asked. "Would you have us defy the council? I would have you choose what the title Jedi means while people who trusted the Republic are being burned out of their homes." That was as close as he came to command. He knew better than to bind loyalty too early with explicit disobedience. Better they understand the gravity of stepping forward. Mitra spoke then, and because she had been so still, everyone listened. "If we go," she said, "and war changes us, if it changes you, what keeps this from becoming another path into darkness?" Revan turned toward her. It was the right question, perhaps the only question that mattered. "Nothing keeps it," he said. "Not audibly, not intention, not robes. We keep it or fail to. by remembering why we went, by letting other people tell us when we begin to sound like the enemy, by refusing the comfort of lies about cost. That is not safety. It is only discipline." Alex smiled sharply. He enjoyed when truth cut. A hollow flickered to life above a crate. Saul Kareth's face appeared in blue static. "I have a situation," he said without preamble. "Vanquo refinery basin. Civilian extraction underway. Mandalorian raiders have punched through local defense and are using the Stormfront to mask dissent. If no one intervenes, the basin falls in under 4 hours." "Officially?" Alec asked. "Officially," Kareth said. "I was never in this room." That broke the tension just enough for a few grim breaths of laughter. They went in a freighter stripped of markings and packed beyond regulation with med supplies, improvised shield generators, and more courage than authorization. Revan wore the red mask before they broke atmosphere over Vanquo. No one commented on it. The change was too immediate to require language. He was still Revan. And not. A symbol had entered the room and found no one willing to turn away. Vanquo was all storm and industry. The sky hung low and iron-colored, shot through with dirty lightning from the refinery stacks. Vast fuel towers rose out of the mud flats like cathedral organs built for a faith in extraction and fire. Pipes ran for kilometers over the ground on rust-red supports. Between them, workers and families were already evacuating toward crawler convoys, their faces shining with rain and fear. The Mandalorians came through the weather almost invisible until they were inside it. Basilisk riders burst from cloud in shrieking dives. Troop carriers skimmed low over the basin and spilled Neo-Crusaders into the maze of catwalks and pump stations. Local militia, never designed for this kind of assault, broke in the first 10 minutes. Revan landed at the center of panic and found, as he had suspected, that fear loved structure when structure arrived with confidence. "You," he said to a refinery foreman still clutching a datapad like a weapon, "show me the fuel pressure grids. You, get every child and non-essential worker under Pipe Run C. Do not scatter. Scatter and you die alone. Move in lines. Shield generators here, and here. Mitra, take the east convoy and keep them off the exposed flats. Alec, South Tower access. If the riders get the ignition controls, we lose the basin." And, There was no time to ask if the civilians trusted him. Obedience came because the alternative had already failed. Rain battered the mask. Lightning flashed white across the visor. Revan moved through the refinery like a blade pulled from dark water, cutting lines where they needed cutting, binding them where they needed binding. He used the terrain the way he had used Serroco's convoys, not to seek elegant victory, but to deny the enemy the moral and tactical advantages they expected. Pipe farms became choke points. Elevated walkways became kill corridors for militia with borrowed carbines. A decommissioned fuel crawler, reactivated in seconds by 2 terrified mechanics and 1 jetty's impossible concentration, was turned broadside to shield 100 evacuees crossing open mud under fire. Mitra proved quieter in battle than Alec, but no less effective. She moved with compact precision through the evac lines, deflecting shots meant for children, breaking panic before it spread, hauling the wounded with bare determination when her hands were needed more than her saber. Once Revan saw her pause over a dead worker and close his staring eyes before rising to fight again. That too was part of why some people survived war and others merely remained alive after it. Alec took the South Tower like he had been born for industrial slaughter. He led Marines and volunteers straight up a rain-slick access spine under blaster fire, laughing once when a Basilisk rider nearly clipped his head with a wingtip. The tower shivered with impacts. By the time he reached ignition control, 3 Mandalorians lay in the stairwell, and 1 local militiawoman who had followed him was bleeding from the abdomen and still trying to reload with shaking hands. Canderous hit the west line at the head of a boarding detachment repurposed for ground assault. Vanquo's weather delighted him. Rain made movement primal. Mud made footing honest. Here, at last, the enemy did not sit behind Senate arguments or ship hulls. Here they met steel to will, and the masked Jedi at the Basin Center moved with a discipline he had only heard rumors of. That was Revan then. The name had already gathered heat through Republic channels. Canderous saw at once why. The mask was a provocation, a Mandalorian face worn by a Jedi in defiance, or perhaps in warning. Canderous could not decide which angered him more. Yet, the man beneath it did not fight like a showman. No wasted flourishes. No drunken heroics. He saw the field as if standing above it and inside it at once, anticipating where terror would break formation, where civilians would choke an escape line, where a fuel main could be burst at the right second to wall off a basilisk charge and atomize fire. Canderous took a squad across a collapsed pipe bridge and nearly met him there. A group of workers had become trapped between a ruptured condenser and a half-sunk ore hauler. Mandalorians closed from one side, rising fuel fire from the other. Revan arrived first, cut through the hauler's jammed loading clamp, and shouted for the workers to move through the gap. Canderous dropped from the pipe span into the mud 10 meters away. For one suspended instant, the rain made a veil between them. Red mask, blue-gray armor. Jedi and Mandalorian standing amid steam and flame while civilians stumbled past. Canderous raised his rifle. Revan's saber came up. Neither fired. Neither struck. A secondary blast from the condenser threw molten metal across the space between them and forced both apart. When Canderous regained footing, the workers were gone and the masked Jedi with them. He laughed once into his helmet. Not from humor, but from the shock of having finally seen something worth crossing stars to fight. By dusk, the basin still stood. Not whole. Vanquo would wear the scars for years. One of the outer towers had collapsed. 2 crawler convoys burned in the flats. Hundreds were dead. But thousands lived, and more importantly, they had been saved by a force the Republic had not officially admitted existed. The legend began there in mud and thunder. The Jedi in the red Mandalorian mask who arrived before the Senate and stayed after the bombardment, who organized workers and soldiers and frightened families into something like a line, who refused to leave while one convoy still limped through the rain. When the surviving Mandalorians withdrew to regroup, Revan climbed the half-destroyed southern platform and looked over the basin. Bodies lay under thermal sheets, weighted with spare tools against the wind. Med teams moved among the wounded. Workers who only hours before had scattered in panic now hauled hoses, reinforced shelters, and counted each other by name. That was the hidden truth of rescue. It did not merely preserve life. It restored relation. It told the living they had not been abandoned by reality itself. Alec came up beside him, blood on his jaw and rain pouring off his hair. "Well," he said, breathing hard. "Now it's done." Revan did not ask what he meant. Below them, a little boy in refinery orange looked up at the platform and pointed. 3 others followed his hand. Across the battered basin, people had begun whispering the name into one another's shock. Revan Dongshi. Not the observer from the temple. Not the counselor from the Senate galleries. The one who had come. He felt no triumph. Only weight. Behind the visor, his breath sounded like someone else. By the time they returned to Coruscant, the Holonet had named them. Not directly. The Republic excelled at indirect speech when courage lagged. Commentators spoke of unauthorized intervention, of charismatic dissidents within the Order, of Revanchist sentiment among younger Jedi and military officers frustrated by Senate hesitation. The word spread because it was ugly and useful. Revanchists. People who wanted answer, reprisal, return. People gathered around Revan whether he intended the gravity or not. The Council's recall came before the landing clamps sealed. Revan ignored it for 3 hours. He used those hours to walk the lower refugee terraces with Ylira, because there are moments when hearing the living matters more than obeying the wise. Coruscant's underlevels had made room for thousands displaced by frontier war. The room was too generous a word for stacked bunks beneath maintenance galleries and old freight bays partitioned by cloth. People adapted because living beings always adapted until adaptation became the shame of those who forced it. Ylira moved more strongly now, though a limp remained in her left leg, and one side of her neck still showed the gleam of healing tissue. The first time she had seen Revan wearing the mask, she had not spoken for several breaths. Now she walked beside him without looking directly at it. "They fear you," she said. "Who?" "Everyone." Her ears twitched. "The Senate fears what you reveal about them. The Council fears where war might lead you. The refugees fear needing someone this much." "No." Revan looked out across a vast sleeping tier where families from Cathar, Serroco, and lesser-known worlds shared heat units and rumor in equal measure. "Do you fear me?" Ylira considered. "I fear masks." "That is not the same answer." "No," she said. "It is more honest." They stopped at a memorial alcove improvised from an old shrine niche. Names had been written there in ink, grease pencil, stylus etching, anything survivors could use. Some were full names. Some were only first names because no one left alive knew the rest. Some were descriptions. "My son with the bent ear. Lessa's husband, the old woman from the eastern dock with kind hands." War always outpaced record-keeping. Love did not need official spelling. Ylira touched the edge of one etched plate. "When I gave you that mask, I did not give you leave to become what wore it before." Revan's voice stayed quiet. "I know." "Do you?" He turned toward her fully. "No," he said after a moment. "Not as certainty, only as work." That answer seemed to satisfy her more than assurance would have. She nodded once. "Good. Good. Certainty is how monsters sleep." In the hidden chamber beneath the temple, the crowd had doubled from the first meeting. Young knights stood shoulder to shoulder with Republic officers on unofficial leave, quartermasters who had quietly diverted supplies to border relief, healers who had seen too much of the war arrive after the fighting was done. Saul Karath's hologram floated above a makeshift table map outdotty. Mitra stood near the front now, not because she sought notice, but because decision had moved her inward. "The Council will move against open defiance by morning," Karath said. "The Senate will issue condemnations phrased to preserve deniability. I can place 3 cruisers and 2 support frigates outside the standard registry sweep for 12 hours. After that, anyone flying with you is doing so openly." A murmur went through the room. Not fear, exactly. The sound of people realizing abstraction had hardened into time. A young Padawan, barely older than an initiate, asked, "If we leave, are we still Jedi?" No one laughed at him. It was too real. Revan removed the mask before answering. He wanted them to hear a man, not a symbol. "That depends," he said, "on whether the title means obedience to the most cautious interpretation of duty, or fidelity to the living force as it moves through those we are sworn to protect." Rook would have called that rhetoric. Perhaps it was. Truth often sounded like rhetoric to those who had arranged their lives to avoid its implications. "I will not lie to you," Revan continued. "If you come with me, some of you will die. Some will survive and wish you had not. Some will discover in yourselves capacities you fear. War does not reveal only virtue. It reveals appetite, pride, anger, the temptation to solve every future problem with force because force once worked. If you follow me, you do so without innocence. And if any of you believe I cannot fall, leave now. I may be wrong about the path ahead. I know only that staying still has become another way of choosing who dies." "Nah. I didn't. There's you, Donor." No one left. Mitra stepped forward first. She did not kneel. None of them did. This was not fealty. It was alignment. "I'll go," she said. One by one, others joined. Alec at Revan's shoulder looked almost radiant in the low light, as if some private prophecy had at last found language. Karath's hologram remained expressionless, but there was a hard brightness in his eyes that suggested relief too deep for open display. When the chamber emptied enough for movement, Revan stood alone for a moment beneath ancient stone. The temple above them had been home, school, discipline, inheritance. He could still smell its library dust and incense in memory. He did not hate the Order. That made leaving harder, not easier. Vandar was waiting on the outer stair when he emerged. The small master stood beneath an arch open to the night, city light pouring silver and gold around him. No guards, no witnesses. He had chosen mercy in private, which was perhaps the most Jedi thing left to offer. "You have chosen," Vandar said. "Yes, and nothing I say will alter it." "No." The old master drew a long breath. "Then hear only this. The path from compassion to control is shorter than you think. In war, many cruelties first present themselves as efficiencies. When that begins, remember the faces beneath your strategies." "No." Revan felt the words enter him more deeply than any rebuke Vrook had delivered. "I will remember," he said. Vandar's eyes, ancient and unbearably kind, moved to the mask in Revan's hand. "See that it does not remember you more strongly than you remember yourself." They parted without blessing. Near dawn, on a discreet military platform cut into one of Coruscant's endless lower towers, the first Revanchist ships lifted in silence. Saul's hidden cruisers waited above the city glow with running lights dark. Mechanics loaded supplies at double pace. Jedi in plain travel robes moved through the haze carrying duffels instead of relic cases, field medpacks instead of holocrons. It was not a grand departure. No crowds cheered. No Senate bells rang. History often left home looking like smuggling. Ylira came to the platform edge as the last ramp began to rise. Revan had the mask on again. She searched the featureless red visage for something human and found perhaps the slight stillness that meant he was listening. "Bring them back if you can," she said. He understood she did not mean only the people boarding the ships. "I will try." "That is not the same as promising." "No," he said. "It isn't." The ramp sealed. Coruscant fell away beneath them, tower lights dwindling into rivers of gold threaded through darkness. The temple remained visible longest, a bright geometry on a rise of stone, serene even now. Revan watched until cloud and distance swallowed it. Then he turned toward the bridge, where war waited without further interest in whether he felt ready. Jaga's cluster was not beautiful space. It was useful space. Old freight routes crossed there around a loose congregation of icy bodies and abandoned transfer stations built in some earlier period of optimism when merchants believed traffic alone could civilize danger. By the time Revan arrived, optimism had long since rusted off the stations, but utility remained. Refugees from 3 threatened worlds were being rerouted through the cluster under minimal escort because the main lanes had become killing grounds. Minimal escort turned out to be the exact weakness the Mandalorians desired. The Revanchist flotilla was still learning itself. Ships from disparate commands, crews unaccustomed to one another, Jedi not yet trained to function as a single military arm. Revan knew all this and came anyway. Because delay had become a form of consent, he no longer possessed the capacity to practice. Saul Kareth commanded the central cruiser line. Alec held a roving assault group built for Marines, volunteers, and anyone reckless enough to call improvisation a doctrine. Mitra coordinated evacuation vectors with the focus of someone stitching order out of a torn garment, while fire licked the edges. When the first distress beacon from transfer station, Orek, began broadcasting a child's voice begging for help, Revan knew it was bait. He also knew he could not ignore it. That was the cruelty. The Mandalorians were no longer content merely to exploit compassion in the abstract. They had become intimate students of how moral beings trap themselves. "Signal is looped," Mitra reported from the bridge pit. "Very clean work." Kareth's jaw set. "We have civilian lifeboats sheltering under that station's thermal shadow." Revan looked at the tactical holo and saw the shape of the trap before the enemy appeared. Station Aurek at the center. Refugee barges clustered too near it. The ice field constricting maneuver lanes. A second transmission burst from the far side of the cluster, not distress this time, but panicked chatter from convoy pilots who had spotted shapes moving in the debris. "Stand down all unnecessary emissions," Revan ordered. Break the convoy into cell groups of 5 and assign each a shadow escort. Kareth, if they hit the station, don't hold formation. Formation is what they want us married to. Me. Kareth gave him a sidelong look. He had begun, in the short span since Coruscant, to study Revan the way officers studied maps whose accuracy they had not yet decided to trust absolutely. And what do you want? Movement, Revan said, and room to lose something smaller than the whole. The Mandalorians erupted from the ice. They came not in a single wave but in coordinated layers, using the glittering debris field to hide vectors until the last instant. Missile pods detached from disguised salvage hulks. Basilisk riders skated across spinning chunks of station wreckage and launched from them with predatory precision. Neo-Crusader frigates rose dark and sudden from the blind side of Orek's thermal profile and opened fire on the convoy's support ships before their engines had fully cleared the shadow. The first minute cost the Revanchists 2 corvettes and half a dozen lifeboats. Station Orek is venting atmosphere, Mitra called. Revan watched a spray of white vapor bloom against the black. Through magnification, he could see people. Tiny, impossible people. Thrown from a ruptured docking ring and freezing before the mind could assign them names. Mandalore had come in person. Revan knew it not from insignia, which sensors only confirmed later, but from the architecture of the assault. This was not merely terror. It was challenge. The Mandalorians were asking whether the Republic's new champion could choose under pressure without breaking his own myths. Good, Revan thought, and surprised himself with the coldness of it. Then, let him watch. Cell groups Delta through Kappa. Break left into the ice seam and power low. Let them think you're dead. Kareth, burn hard for the station breach and use your dorsal guns to blind the Basilisk approach. Alec, boarding group to Ark's inner ring. You take the AVAC spine. Alec's laugh burst over comms, bright with battle hunger. I was wondering when you'd give me something impossible. The fight became fragmentation. No grand lines. No elegant charge. Only nodes of desperate action scattered through black and blue light. Revan took the lead attack shuttle himself. Through the red visor, exploding ice looked like shattered mirrors catching fire. One of the refugee barges ahead spun with half its engines gone. Children pressed white-faced to the viewport as their pilot tried to decide whether to flee or hold position long enough to pick up an escape pod cluster. Revan ordered tractor support and moved past, because war punished anyone who stared too long at a single grief. On Orek Station, the inner ring had already become close quarters slaughter. Neo-Crusaders in magnetized boots drove civilians toward the cargo spindle where they could be used as shield mass against counterattack. Alec met them in the breach with a scream torn half from laughter and half from fury, Marines surging behind him. He fought as if gravity were a rumor, rebounding from spar to spar, ripping momentum into weapon. Revan passed him once in the smoke and saw a gash along Alec's temple pouring blood into one eye. Alec grinned through it like a man who had just remembered the galaxy was honest after all. Canderous boarded from the opposite side. He had asked for this vector specifically once Mandalore identified the masked Jedi's likely response pattern. The Republic champion saved people first. Command nodes second. Good. Good. Then make the people in the nodes the same place and see what kind of calculus he chose. Canderous respected the design even as he raced through the station's wrecked service tube with 3 warriors at his heels and the smell of vented coolant in his nose. He found Revan at the cargo spindle. Dozens of civilians were crouched behind overturned container sleds, while blaster fire ricocheted overhead in lines of blue-white death. A decompression alarm shrieked without pause. One side of the spindle had torn open to space and emergency fields shimmered raggedly across the gap. Revan stood between the civilians and a closing Mandalorian wedge, saber turning shot after shot aside with a precision that made anger feel childish. This time there was no exploding condenser to divide them. Canderous came in low rifle discarded for blade once the corridor tightened too much for clean fire. Revan met him with the economy of someone who had already accounted for 7 other dangers. Steel struck light. Sparks fanned across the emergency field. For a heartbeat, Canderous understood exactly why men began legends around opponents like this. Revan fought without waste, and waste was what lesser warriors used when they wished to resemble passion. "You wear our face," Canderous said through helmet speakers, driving hard. Revan's reply came cool as forged glass. "I wear a choice, one of yours made." The words landed harder than the saber lock. Canderous snarled and broke away, not because he had lost, but because the entire spindle lurched under new impact, and the civilians behind Revan screamed as one section of the emergency field dimmed. Duty split every fighter's attention. Revan turned first. Of course he did, hurling one toppled container into place to brace the failing projector. Canderous took the opening to pull his surviving men back through the service tube before the spindle became vacuum. On the bridge of his command ship, Mandalore watched the battle unfold in layered holography. The masked Jedi was learning quickly. Too quickly for comfort if one hoped the Republic would remain soft. Revan had already begun making the choices that separated rescuers from commanders. Dividing the convoy into sacrificially flexible cells. Letting one support ship die to draw fire off 3 lifeboat lanes. Ordering Oryx out a ring sealed despite known survivors there because leaving it open would cost the inner evac spine. None of these were decisions a man could make while preserving perfect innocence. Good. War required apprenticeship in loss. "Shall we press the center?" Cassis asked over secure link. Mandalore considered the blue storm of data Tadai. "Not yet. Watch him." Cassis disliked waiting during advantage, but discipline held. "He bleeds." "Of course he does," Mandalore said. "That is how steel learns what shape it can keep." Back on Oryx, Revan saw the battle's cruelest line all at once. Kareth's cruiser group had cleared a path for nearly half the refugee lifeboats. The remaining half were trapped behind the station's failing shadow, pinned between basilisk riders and a drifting fuel hauler already burning from stem to stern. If he committed his reserve squadron to save them, the Mandalorian frigates approaching from the far ice seam would cut through the Revanchist command ships, and the entire cluster would collapse. If he held the reserves back, those lifeboats died. Numbers appeared in his mind, not as abstractions, but as faces. He hated that he could still count this way. He hated more that he had to. "Reserve Squadron, Oryx 2, he said into comms, voice flat enough to keep the ship from hearing the fracture. "Burn across the lifeboat lane and draw pursuit to your vector. Do not attempt to return. Your objective is time." "May." Silence answered first. Then the reserve leader, a woman from a mid-rim patrol whose name Revan knew and would remember after, said only, "Understood." Kareth looked up from his own board at exactly the moment the reserve squadron broke from cover. He did not ask if Revan understood what he had done. The question would have been insult. The squadron flew beautifully. They cut across the lifeboat lane in a tight, impossible fan, shields flaring, guns bright, every ship on a trajectory it could not survive. Mandalorian riders pivoted in delighted pursuit. 2 reserve craft died immediately. A third spun burning through the seam and took a basilisk with it. The lifeboats slipped the gap. Thousands lived because hundreds had been deliberately spent. The battle tipped. Not to victory. Jaga's cluster still bled. Oryx Station was lost. Debris would carry names unspoken for years. But the Revanchists did not break. The convoy escaped in enough numbers to matter. Kareth's cruisers withdrew in order. Alec emerged from Oryx's wreck with a collapsed lung, 2 broken fingers, and the grin of a man who had survived something magnificent. Mitra oversaw the recovery lines with blood on her sleeve that was not all her own. Canderous returned to his shuttle with one shoulder scored through the armor and admiration lodged in him like a thorn. As the Mandalorians disengaged, Revan stood on the damaged bridge and watched their flagship turn slowly beyond the ice field. He could not see Mandalore's face. Only the dark certainty of the ship's motion, the composure of an enemy not disappointed by failure because failure had not been the point. The comboard blinked with casualty tallies. Revan did not look away. After battle came arithmetic. The dead were identified when they could be, mourned provisionally when they could not. Hull loss percentages, medbay capacity, reactor strain, munitions depletion. Projected fuel burn to the next safe harbor. War loved numbers for the same reason bureaucracies did. They allowed pain to be handled without collapsing beneath it. Revan learned within days that command required moving between the language of grief and the language of logistics without letting either annihilate the other. It was harder than battle. In battle, the body knew what to do. Afterward, only the mind remained, and the mind was treacherous. He stood alone on the observation deck of the flagship they had repurposed as mobile command. Jaga's cluster was gone behind them, though fragments of it still drifted across the external screens and captured telemetry. Spinning station debris, frozen light on ice, the final transponder pulse of the reserve squadron leader, whose name he had already carved into memory like penance. The red mask rested in his hands rather than on his face. Behind him, the deck doors whispered open. Alec came in first, chest bound under his tunic, fingers splinted, moving with the controlled recklessness of a man whom injury only insulted. Mitra followed more quietly. The battle had marked her in a way blood did not show. Some losses entered through sight and stayed behind the eyes. "You should sleep," Mitra said. "So should you," Revan answered. She accepted that without contradiction. Alec leaned one shoulder against the bulkhead and watched the stars. "We won enough," he said. Revan looked at him. "Is that how you name it?" Alec shrugged with one good shoulder. "We got the convoy out. We didn't shatter. Mandalore came to measure us and learn the Republic can finally answer. Call it what you like." Mitra's gaze moved to the mask in Revan's hands. "And the squadron you spent?" Alec's jaw tightened. "They knew the order when they took it." "That isn't what I asked." Silence widened between them. Revan could have answered as commanders answered, by invoking necessity, proportion, strategic preservation. "All true. All insufficient. I knew what the order would cost," he said at last. "And I gave it." Mitra waited. "If I say I hated it, that changes nothing," he continued. "If I say I would do differently next time to comfort us, that would be a lie. We were minutes from losing the convoy and the fleet. I chose the smaller death because command required a choice, but I will not pretend the necessity cleansed it." Mitra closed her eyes briefly, as if setting the words somewhere painful but stable. "Good," she said, "because I followed you to war, not to a machine." Alec gave a rough exhale that might once have become argument, and instead died unfinished. For all his ferocity, even he understood something sacred had been preserved by forcing the truth to stay ugly. When they left him, Revan remained at the viewport. He thought of the council chamber, of Vandar's warning that efficiencies were often cruelties wearing disciplined clothes. He had already crossed that threshold once. Not into darkness, perhaps. Not yet. But across a line no honest commander could deny existed. There would be more such lines. Each one would come dressed as urgency. Each one would arrive asking whether intention could survive outcome. He did not know if the answer would remain yes. He knew only that ignorance no longer excused refusal. On Coruscant, far from the stars where the battle's wreckage still cooled, Ylira lit memorial candles in the refugee alcove. The names written on the wall had multiplied. Jaga's clustered dead were still being confirmed, yet survivors had already begun adding them. The reserve squadron leader's name appeared in clear block script. Beside it, someone had etched simply, "Held the lane." Ylira touched the new letters and thought of the man who had taken a dead enemy's mask from her hands with the solemnity of accepting burden rather than glory. She had watched the holonet feeds from unofficial relay channels, now passed among refugees like contraband prayer. She had seen the red mask on command decks and in evacuation corridors, heard the commentators call him hero, dissident, fanatic, necessary danger. Perhaps he was all of them. War made categories breed like vermin. A child from Serroco, narrow-shouldered and solemn, stood beside her with a taper and shaking fingers. "Will he stop them?" the child asked. Ylira looked at the wall of names, at the candles, at the endless undercity full of people who had once believed the Republic too vast to fail them. "He will answer them," she said. The child accepted that, though it was not promise enough to comfort an adult. In the council chamber, Vandar sat alone after dusk. The other masters had gone to meditation, to archives, to quiet arguments held behind doors the temple pretended were not political. Rook called Revan's departure the first collapse of discipline into vanity. Doric feared schism. Jar feared despair. Kavar said little, which worried Vandar more than speeches ever could. He reached out through the Force and found the galaxy loud with pain. Too loud for any single center to contain. The old dream that the Order might stand above war and thereby preserve something necessary now seemed frayed in ways even wisdom could not neatly mend. Perhaps Revan was wrong. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps both were merely incomplete words in an age demanding acts. Vandar had lived long enough to know history rarely offered pure positions. It offered tragedies, in which each side carried some portion of truth and paid for it with some different portion of innocence. He looked at the empty seat where Revan had once stood before the council, all talent and restless gravity, and felt not anger but mourning for a future that had just changed shape. Far beyond Coruscant, on the bridge of his flagship, Mandalore the Ultimate studied a combat reconstruction of Jaga's cluster. The hollow-rendered ships as blue wireframes and deaths as blinking marks. It was inadequate. Still, patterns emerged. Here the masked Jedi split his convoy. Here he sacrificed reserves. Here he refused the false grandeur of trying to save everything, and instead preserved what could still alter the war's course. Cassius stood at Mandalore's right. He learns quickly. He does. We can kill him. Mandalore turned his visor slightly toward the strategist. Perhaps, but killing a blade before it has fully hardened teaches less than letting it strike. Cassius did not hide his distaste for metaphor. And if it hardens against us... Mandalore watched the red-marked command icon move through the holographic battle. Then the Republic will finally have become worthy of conquering. For him, this was not contradiction. Worthy enemies were the only enemies that mattered. An easy Republic proved decadence. A hard one proved the galaxy might yet be shaped into something that could survive harsher masters still waiting beyond the known dark. Whether he would rule that stronger galaxy or merely forge it in conflict mattered less to Mandalore than the forging itself. Canderous, dismissed from med treatment and still raw from the wound in his shoulder, watched the same hollow later in a quieter room. He paused the image on the moment the masked Jedi turned to brace a failing emergency field for trapped civilians, rather than finish a duel. That choice irritated him. It also compelled him. Many warriors talked honor. Fewer possessed a loyalty that disrupted clean victory. Fewer still could combine it with command. Canderous suspected the war had become more interesting than anything he had ever been promised. Aboard his flagship, Revan finally raised the red mask and looked at his reflected eyes in the dark visor. He thought of the unnamed Mandalorian woman on Cathar who had refused one order and died for it. He thought of Ylira preserving that refusal as witness rather than simplification. He thought of Serroco, Vanquo, Jaga's cluster, of Alec's bright violence and Mitra's hard questions and Saul Caratha's unsentimental trust. He thought of Vandar's warning, and understood that memory itself might be the only defense against becoming efficient in the wrong direction. Then he set the mask on and returned to the bridge. There were more worlds ahead. More convoys. More cities whose names the Corps pronounced only once they were burning. The Republic, slow and splendid and half asleep, had not yet fully accepted that it was at war. The Mandalorians had not yet reached the heart they intended to break. The Jedi had not yet finished dividing around the man who now walked their absent middle ground in a dead enemy's face. But something irreversible had begun. In the dark between systems, under the cold witness of stars no Senate could debate and no council could calm, Revan took command of the next jump. Behind him, the crew straightened around fear and fatigue. Ahead of him, Mandalore waited with all the patience of a hunter who had finally heard, from very far off, the first honest answer to his challenge. And the galaxy, not yet understanding what it had asked for, turned slowly toward war.